The book, The Dictator's Handbook, subtitle, Why Bad Behavior is Almost Always Good Politics, is a book from 2011 written by Alastair Smith and Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, two professors of political science at NYU. The book is structured around a relatively simple model for thinking about politics. This model is called the Selectorate model of politics. The book explains this model, and then it goes on to explore the wide-ranging, often very profound implications of this Selectorate model of politics. So where does this Selectorate model of politics come from? So the model is premised on one very simple idea, which the authors describe as follows. Quote, "To understand politics properly, we must modify one assumption in particular. We must stop thinking that leaders can lead unilaterally. No emperor, no king, no sheik, no tyrant, no CEO, no family head, no leader whatsoever can ever govern alone." End quote. This is the big insight of the Dictator's Handbook. If we want to understand who achieves power and how power is going to operate in a society, if we want to understand why power operates differently in different societies, it's necessary to explore the question of power from the perspective of the people in power and from the perspective of the people trying to attain power in society. So what is the Selectorate model of politics? So let's imagine that you are trying to attain power. In that case, there are three groups of people that you should be very worried about, very interested in. The authors describe these three groups as the three political dimensions that can be used to characterize any society or any political system or any institution of power. And these three political dimensions can be used to very accurately predict whether or not a particular society will have good or bad political outcomes. So what are the three groups in the Selectorate model of politics? The first group is called the winning coalition. This is the group of people whose support is necessary for keeping a ruler in power. This is the group of people that have the power to put you in power or to take it away from you. If the ruler loses the support of their winning coalition, they're immediately vulnerable to replacement. Moreover, the winning coalition lends its support to a particular candidate or to a ruler on the condition that the ruler is going to use their power and use their resources to reimburse and pay back the winning coalition. In a third world dictatorship, the winning coalition includes only the most powerful people in that society. Especially prominent are the army generals, for example, because the support of the army generals is necessary for quashing any popular rebellions. In a high-functioning democracy, this group of a winning coalition is significantly larger. It includes campaign donors, which are necessary for financing the hundreds of millions of dollars that modern electoral campaigns cost. It includes the voters who elect politicians to public office. And it includes the members of Congress with the power to impeach you. So, where do these winning coalitions come from? The next key idea of the Selectorate model of politics is that not all members of a winning coalition are equal in the eyes of power. Political capital is not distributed evenly in a society. Not everyone can play the same role in a winning coalition. In the Selectorate model, we recognize that winning coalitions can include two different types of people in a society. And those two different types of people are the two other groups that you need to be very concerned about. So one is the nominal selectorate and the other is the real selectorate. The main difference between the nominal selectorate and the real selectorate is how valuable each individual is from the perspective of power and how useful each individual is for the forming and maintaining of a winning coalition. So members of the real selectorate are extremely critical to the creation of a stable winning coalition. Members of the real selectorate wield a huge amount of political power or political capital. In democracy, American democracy, for example, campaign donors, GOP or DNC party officials, and superdelegates are all members of the real Selectorate in American politics. The nominal Selectorate, on the other hand, is composed of regular people, people with the bare minimum amount of political capital in a society. The regular American voter is a member of the nominal Selectorate. In U.S. corporations and authoritarian societies like Communist Russia or Communist China, the rulers are really determined by a real Selectorate, which is a relatively small population of people, like a board of directors or some political council, that have the power to choose the rulers in the society. In a high-functioning democracy, there's a much less clear distinction between the nominal Selectorate and the real Selectorate. Instead, we have more of a bimodal distribution of political capital. From the Selectorate model of politics, we can start thinking about different configurations of these groups. We can start thinking about how power wants to interact with these groups and wants to relate to these groups, and what are the ideal configurations for staying in power as long as possible, for consolidating one's rule. So based on this model, the authors put forth 5 rules for rulers. These are the rules that we would expect all rulers to obey in any country, in any company or institution of power, if they hope to stay in power. So rule number 1, keep the winning coalition as small as possible. A small winning coalition is a stable winning coalition. If the winning coalition is small, then it's very easy for the ruler to pay off members of the winning coalition for support. Number 2, keep the nominal Selectorate as large as possible. People are less likely to rebel if they see themselves as part of a nominal Selectorate. And a large nominal Selectorate is a large pool of people from which rulers can swap out members of the real Selectorate, and even members of their own winning coalition if necessary. The Dictator's Handbook gives many examples of rulers expanding their nominal Selectorate with the aim of increasing the stability of their reign. Vladimir Lenin introducing universal suffrage to Russia's rigged election system is one such example. Rule number 3, maximize the money available for paying off the winning coalition. The reason the winning coalition is going to support you is because you, as the ruler, have access to money. If ever you find yourself in the act of overthrowing a corrupt dictator, the first thing you need to do after you've killed your predecessor is to figure out where the money comes from and how to control the money. Because without access to sufficient funds, your winning coalition will quickly abandon you and replace you with someone who can reimburse them better. Rule number 4, pay your winning coalition just enough to keep them happy, no more, no less. Rule number 5, don't take money away from members of the winning coalition to make other people's lives better. This means don't be generous. Don't be altruistic. If you try to be altruistic, you will be replaced by someone less altruistic. The Dictator's Handbook gives numerous examples of dictatorial regimes doing the bare minimum to keep their military generals happy, and gives other examples of dictators that chose to be altruistic, that chose to invest money into the welfare of their society and the average citizen, the nominal Selectorate, and as a result were summarily deposed. It's not uncommon, for example, for dictators in the third world to funnel foreign aid they get in the wake of some natural disaster to their military, so that the military generals can profit at the cost of the nominal Selectorate, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of people dying from starvation. One of the key takeaways of the Dictator's Handbook is that this kind of bad behavior is natural, in a way. It should be expected. If these autocrats were to give the foreign aid to their citizens, the winning coalition would replace that autocrat with someone who wouldn't give the foreign aid to the citizens. And compounding this tendency towards corruption and bad political outcomes is the fact that members of a winning coalition are very often powerful people who are only in power because they are beholden to their own subsidiary winning coalition. Members of a winning coalition have pressures to extract as much money as possible from power because they need to use that money to pay off the people who are keeping them in power. For example, military generals or corporate CEOs who wanted to be altruistic and failed to maximize the profit they're earning from the people in power that they're supporting would immediately become susceptible to replacement by some other army general or some other CEO who was less altruistic and did a better job of extracting money from the government that they're supporting. So the next big question in the Dictator's Handbook is, what makes democracy work? Given this fairly pessimistic view of political corruption, of bad political outcomes, why is it that affluent, successful democracies exist? So the answer is as follows. Governments supported by large winning coalitions and societies where political capital is distributed equitably, such that the real selectorate is very large and the nominal selectorate is part of the winning coalition, it becomes impossible for power to reimburse and pay off their winning coalition with private goods. If a winning coalition is sufficiently large, you can't pay them off with highly targeted tax breaks or building contracts to particular companies that support you, or with bribes or exorbitant salaries. When a winning coalition gets sufficiently large, the only way to reliably pay off a winning coalition is to invest in public goods like roads, hospitals, a social safety net, etc. So the only way to pay off the winning coalition is to pay off everyone in society. That's the magic of democracy. And one of the key takeaways of this book that the authors keep emphasizing is that the dictatorship-democracy dichotomy is actually purely fictitious. Autocracies and democracies are not two different kinds of government that are qualitatively different, but rather they're two ends of a spectrum of winning coalition size, of how many people are the people in power beholden to. How many people are they trying to pay off? One such quote from the book. Quote, "You may find it hard to believe that just these three dimensions govern all the varied systems of leadership in the world. After all, our experience tends to confirm that on one end of the political spectrum, we have autocrats and tyrants, horrible, selfish thugs who occasionally stray into psychopathology. On the other end, we have Democrats, elected representatives, presidents and prime ministers, who are the benevolent guardians of freedom. Leaders from these two worlds, we assure ourselves, must be worlds apart. It's a convenient fiction, but a fiction nonetheless. Governments do not differ in kind. They differ along the dimensions of their selectorates and winning coalitions. These dimensions limit or liberate what leaders can and should do to keep their jobs. How limited or liberated a leader is depends on how selectorates and winning coalitions interact." End quote. The main idea of the Dictator's Handbook is this. Governments control the money, and they can use that money to invest in public goods, or they can use that money to invest in private goods. And the amount of money that will be invested in public goods for the benefit of everyone in society is roughly proportional to the size of the winning coalition. One of the studies quoted in the book to illustrate the way even small differences in the size of a leader's winning coalition can affect political outcomes is as follows. Quote, "At the time of its independence, the United States was composed of 13 states. They all had broadly the same first-past-the-post electoral rules, and yet their record of performance was remarkably different. It's easy to be sloppy and think that they all had the same political system, governed by the United States Constitution, so that their differences must have come from somewhere else. In reality, however, their political systems were not the same. The Constitution is silent on many issues that are central to governance. The Constitution tells us nothing, for instance, about how to add up votes. Seemingly small differences in enfranchisement rules and districting decisions led to big disparities in the economic and social development of the United States." On average, the northern states developed more rapidly than the southern states. It is tempting to ascribe this to the traditional historical narratives and attribute the general difference to climate or slavery. However, a careful examination of the subtle differences between the states suggests that variations in their political institutions were the main culprit behind how differently they developed. Jeffrey Jensen, a former student of ours and now a faculty member at NYU Abu Dhabi, did a very careful study of the differences in the size of the interchangeables, influentials, and essential groups across the original states. He understood that many thought the differences in development depended on slavery and climate, and so he corrected for these possibilities. Jeff took the size of the slave population carefully into account, just as he also took carefully into account how many frost-free days there were per year in each of the original 13 states. He investigated the distinctions in electoral rules within the early American states that created different levels of dependency on a large or small coalition drawn from a large or small set of interchangeables. His discoveries may not only rewrite how we understand America's early development, but they can also help us understand how to make our own modern democracy do better. And now I'm skipping a few technical paragraphs describing how enfranchisement worked differently in the different states. As the rules to rule by lead us to expect, states in which leaders required support from a larger proportion of the population developed faster. Such states build more extensive canal, rail, and road networks. They also achieve higher educational attainment and were more attractive places for other Americans to migrate to. People left small coalition states and flocked to big coalition states where public services were better and all manner of public goods were more extensively provided. Per capita incomes were much higher and varied almost directly with coalition size, even after correcting for pre-independence differences. States with bigger coalitions simply did better. The lesson here is clear. While all the states had the same nominal rules, redistricting and enfranchisement criteria matter in creating differences in the competitiveness of political systems and the development of the states. If properly attended to, districting and enfranchisement decisions can make the United States an even better place than it currently is. End quote. A lot of us tend to think of democracy as a technology that just works. But this is a dangerous illusion. We should think of democracy as a very rare and precious miracle, something which is inherently unstable, something which we're constantly at risk of losing. Even in a democracy, everyone in power is trying to consolidate their power and stabilize their power by giving more enfranchisement to a small real selectorate and disenfranchising a larger nominal selectorate. This is a process known as democratic backsliding, and it's something that every citizen in a democracy needs to be very sensitive to. American democracy, in the age of the Supreme Court's Citizen United ruling, is characterized by backwards campaign finance laws that allow corporations and a small, extremely wealthy donor class to pour untold amount of money untraceably into political campaigns. American democracy is characterized by an electoral college system that basically disenfranchises every voter in a safely blue or red state in presidential elections, and extremely gerrymandered congressional districts where the incumbency of congressmen is about 97%, despite the fact that Congress has only an 11% approval rating. America is famous for its grotesque system of mass incarceration. America incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, developed or undeveloped. And the effect of being incarcerated is to be permanently politically disenfranchised. These are the effects of people in power actively working to decrease the size of their winning coalition and to stabilize their rule by disenfranchising a nominal electorate. voter ID laws, and voter suppression tactics further consolidate power. They further disenfranchise the nominal selectorate. If you want to understand why America leads the developed world in child poverty, or why Alabama has a kind of destitute squalor not found anywhere else in the developed world, or why the life expectancy of America's poor is similar to that of a third world country, this is why. As winning coalitions get smaller, power becomes more entrenched, and that power is used to further decrease the size of its winning coalition and to further entrench power in a vicious cycle. The politicians, supported by a corporate donor class, used obscene, obstructionist tactics to prevent the confirmation of President Barack Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland. Instead, after Trump became president, Neil Gorsuch was appointed to the Supreme Court. This may sound like a small political victory, but the implications are huge. This appointment will affect the future of gerrymandering in this country, the future of voter suppression and voter ID laws in this country. They affect the future of campaign finance laws in this country, all to secure and stabilize these forms of anti-democratic political disenfranchisement and small coalition politics. Very often this process feels like a one-way ratchet of power entrenching power that we may never be able to reverse. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter how smart we are as a country, how nice, how freedom-loving, how much we care about our fellow Americans. At the end of the day, corruption still happens and can continue to grow here as well. Protecting our democracy means fighting against the laws and the forces of small coalition politics. At the end of the day, we can only expect our democracy to work for us in proportion to our political capital. It's important that we vote, that we exercise our political capital, and that we fight to increase our political capital and fight for a more equitable distribution of political capital in our society, because this is what it takes for democracy to work.